After years of silence, I finally confronted the man he'd been hiding. After years of quiet humiliation, the confrontation finally happened. What began as a painful argument exposed something far deeper than anger or revenge. That moment became a breaking point. On one side stood the man who had spent his life hiding behind fear and control. On the other emerged the version of himself he never allowed the world to see. The shock wasn't only mine, it was his. Because sometimes, when a mask falls, what follows isn't destruction, but an unexpected transformation and the beginning of freedom. If this story helps you understand that living authentically requires courage from everyone involved, please like and subscribe. There are marriages that die not from dramatic betrayals or violent conflicts, but from the slow accumulation of distance created by secrets, from living with someone who's performing a version of themselves rather than being authentic, from the exhausting work of maintaining intimacy with a partner who's hiding fundamental aspects of who they are. For 14 years, I was married to a man who seemed emotionally unavailable and sexually dysfunctional in ways I couldn't understand or address. Someone who erected barriers between us that felt impenetrable and inexplicable. What I didn't know, what he'd hidden with meticulous care throughout our entire relationship, was that my husband Marcus had a completely separate life as a drag performer, that the person he was on stage in clubs I'd never been to was more authentic than the man he performed being at home with me, that his sexual difficulties and emotional distance weren't about me or about our marriage, but about the exhausting toll of living a double life where his true self could only exist in secret. My name is Christina Walker, and I'm 41 years old. I'd been married to Marcus for 14 years when the truth finally emerged. 14 years during which I'd believed our marriage was struggling due to his sexual dysfunction and emotional unavailability. 14 years during which I'd tried everything I could think of to improve our intimacy and connection, while Marcus maintained walls I couldn't penetrate or understand. Marcus worked in IT, had a steady job that provided comfortable middle-class income, seemed like a conventional man living a conventional life. I worked as a middle school teacher, had my own career and friendships, had built a life that looked successful from the outside, even though the marriage at its center felt increasingly hollow and disconnected. The pattern that had defined our marriage from early on was Marcus's difficulty with sexual intimacy, combined with emotional distance that made real connection nearly impossible. Our sex life had never been frequent or passionate. Even in the beginning of our relationship, intimacy had been sporadic and somewhat mechanical, lacking the spontaneity and desire I'd expected from a new relationship. Over the years, sex had become even more infrequent until it was essentially non-existent. Maybe once every few months, always awkward and unsatisfying, always leaving me feeling rejected and confused about what was wrong. When I'd tried to address our sexual difficulties, when I'd suggested we see a doctor or a therapist to explore potential medical or psychological causes, Marcus would become defensive and dismissive. "Not everyone has a high sex drive," he'd say. "Stop making this into a problem when it's just how I am. You're being demanding and unrealistic about what married sex should look like." The gaslighting was subtle, but effective. He made me feel like my desire for regular intimacy was abnormal, like my needs were excessive, like the problem was my expectations rather than our complete lack of physical connection. But beyond the sexual difficulties was something even more troubling. Marcus's emotional unavailability and his pattern of disappearing for hours or sometimes entire evenings without adequate explanation. He'd claim he was working late, or meeting friends, or just needed time alone. Would become angry if I questioned him too closely about where he'd been or what he'd been doing. He was secretive about his phone and computer, would close browsers when I entered rooms, would take calls in private that he claimed were work-related, but that happened at odd hours and seemed to make him anxious rather than professional. The pattern created constant low-level anxiety and suspicion. I assumed Marcus was having an affair. What else could explain the secrecy, the emotional distance, the regular unexplained absences, the complete lack of sexual interest in me? I hired a private investigator twice over the years, trying to document the affair I was certain was happening so I could decide whether to stay in the marriage or leave. But both times, the investigators found nothing. No evidence of Marcus meeting with women, no romantic relationships, no sexual encounters that would explain his behavior. He'd go to places the investigators couldn't fully access, would disappear into buildings or venues they couldn't follow him into without being obvious, would emerge hours later alone without having met with anyone the investigators could identify. The absence of evidence of an affair was almost more frustrating than finding proof would have been. At least an affair would have been explainable, would have given me something concrete to confront or respond to. Instead, I was left with the knowledge that Marcus was hiding something significant, but without any understanding of what that something was. Left feeling rejected and confused, and increasingly certain that our marriage was dying even if I couldn't identify the specific cause. The confrontation that would finally reveal the truth happened on a Friday night about 6 months ago. Marcus had told me he was going out with colleagues from work, would be home late. The usual vague explanation for one of his mysterious absences. But something in me snapped. I was tired of the lies and the secrecy, tired of living in a marriage where I felt constantly rejected and confused, tired of accepting explanations that didn't actually explain anything. I decided to follow him, to see for myself where he was actually going when he claimed to be with work colleagues. I followed Marcus's car from our house to a neighborhood I'd never been to, an area with clubs and bars and nightlife venues that seemed completely unlike anywhere Marcus would normally go. He parked and walked into a club called Mirrors, a place that from the exterior appeared to be some kind of LGBTQ+ venue based on the rainbow flags and the types of people I saw entering. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, processing what this might mean, trying to understand why my apparently straight married husband was entering what appeared to be a gay club on a Friday night. Finally, I went inside. The club was large and dimly lit, with a main stage and multiple bar areas, filled with people who were dressed flamboyantly and theatrically in ways that were clearly part of the venue's culture and purpose. It took me several minutes to understand what I was seeing. This was a drag club, a place where performers did elaborate shows in drag, where the audience was a mix of LGBTQ+ people and allies who came to watch performances that were artistic and celebratory and completely outside my experience. And then I saw Marcus, on stage, transformed completely into someone I didn't recognize, wearing an elaborate gown and wig and makeup, performing a lip-sync number to a song I vaguely recognized, moving with confidence and joy and authenticity I'd never seen in the man I'd been married to for 14 years. The performer on stage was charismatic and engaging and clearly experienced, someone who commanded attention and who seemed completely comfortable and alive in ways that Marcus at home never was. I watched the entire performance in shock, unable to process what I was seeing, unable to integrate this vibrant performer with the emotionally distant, sexually unavailable man I was married to. When Marcus's performance ended and he left the stage, I made my way backstage, pushed past people who tried to stop me, found the dressing room where performers were changing and preparing for their sets. Marcus was sitting at a makeup mirror, removing his wig when I entered the dressing room. Our eyes met in the mirror, his widening in shock and fear as he recognized me, mine probably showing the confusion and hurt and anger I was feeling. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, both processing that the secret he'd kept for our entire relationship had just been exposed in the most undeniable way possible. "We need to talk," I said finally, my voice surprisingly steady despite the emotional turmoil. "Now. Somewhere private." Marcus nodded, clearly terrified but also perhaps relieved that the secret was finally out, that he no longer had to maintain the exhausting performance of being someone he wasn't. We went to a quiet coffee shop that was still open, Marcus still in partial makeup and costume because there hadn't been time for him to fully change. He looked vulnerable and exposed in ways I'd never seen. The confident performer from the stage replaced by someone who was clearly afraid of what was about to happen, of what consequences his revealed secret would have for his marriage and his life. "How long?" I asked simply. "How long have you been doing this?" How long have you been lying to me about where you go and who you are?" Marcus took a shaky breath before answering. "Since before we met," he admitted. "I started performing drag in my early 20s. It's always been part of who I am, not just something I do, but fundamental to my identity and my sense of self. When I met you, I thought I could give it up, could be the conventional straight married man I was supposed to be. But I couldn't. I tried for the first few years of our marriage to stop performing, to just be the husband you expected me to be. But it was killing me. So about 8 years ago, I started performing again in secret, keeping that part of my life completely separate from you and our marriage. The revelation was devastating in its implications. Marcus had been lying to me for our entire relationship, had married me while knowing he had this fundamental part of himself he was hiding, had spent 14 years maintaining elaborate deception that had made genuine intimacy impossible. "Why couldn't you tell me?" I asked, hearing the pain in my own voice. "Why couldn't you trust me with this? Why did you let me spend 14 years thinking there was something wrong with me, thinking I wasn't attractive enough or good enough to make you want me, when the real issue was that you were living a double life?" "I was ashamed," Marcus said, tears running through his makeup. "I grew up being taught that drag was wrong, that men who performed femininity were perverted or sick or disgusting. I'd internalized so much shame about this part of myself that I couldn't imagine anyone accepting it. Couldn't imagine you staying with me if you knew the truth. So I hid it. I married you hoping that having a wife and a conventional life would somehow make the desire to perform go away, would somehow cure me of needing to be the person I am on stage. But it didn't work. And the more I suppressed that part of myself, the less I could be present in our marriage, the less I could be intimate with you, the more emotionally unavailable I became." Marcus explained that his sexual difficulties weren't about me or about lack of attraction. They were about the psychological toll of living inauthentically, of trying to perform conventional masculinity and heterosexuality, when his authentic self was someone who found freedom and joy in performing femininity, and who was actually more sexually attracted to men than to women, even though he'd never acted on that attraction during our marriage. "I'm probably bisexual or possibly gay," Marcus admitted. "I've never let myself fully explore that part of my sexuality because I was so committed to being the straight married man I was supposed to be. But the truth is that performing drag, being allowed to express femininity and to be seen and celebrated for that expression, that's when I feel most myself, most alive, most authentic. And trying to suppress that to be the husband you deserved has made it impossible for me to actually be a good husband to you." I sat with Marcus's revelations, trying to process 14 years of lies and deception, trying to understand that the marriage I'd been living in had been fundamentally false from the beginning, that the man I'd thought I married had never fully existed. "So our entire marriage has been a lie," I said finally. "You married me knowing you had this huge part of yourself you were hiding, knowing you probably weren't even attracted to women, knowing you couldn't be the partner I needed because you were too busy being someone you're not. You let me waste 14 years of my life, let me feel rejected and inadequate and confused, let me blame myself for problems that were actually about you living in the closet." "I know," Marcus said miserably. "I know I've been unfair to you. I know I should have been honest from the beginning, or at least should have told you years ago when I realized I couldn't give up performing. But I was so afraid of losing you, so afraid of losing the conventional life I was supposed to want, so ashamed of who I actually am that I chose deception over honesty. And I've hurt you terribly through that choice. I'm sorry, Christina. I'm so sorry for all the pain I've caused you, for all the years I stole from you by not being honest about who I am." The apology was sincere but also insufficient. Sorry couldn't give me back 14 years of my life, couldn't undo the damage to my self-esteem from years of feeling sexually rejected, couldn't repair the trust that had been destroyed by comprehensive deception. "What happens now?" I asked. "What do you want? Do you want to stay married and keep living this double life? Do you want to come out and live authentically, even if that means ending our marriage? What's the plan, Marcus? Marcus looked anguished as he considered the question. I want to live authentically, he said finally. I want to be able to perform openly without hiding, to explore my sexuality honestly, to stop lying about fundamental aspects of who I am, but I also don't want to hurt you any more than I already have. If you want to stay married and find some way to make this work, I'll try. But I think we both know that's probably not possible. That you deserve a partner who actually desires you and who can be fully present and honest with you. We talked for hours that night, processing years of deception and distance, acknowledging that our marriage had been built on false foundations that couldn't support genuine partnership. By the time we left the coffee shop as the sun was rising, we'd agreed to separate, to begin the process of ending a marriage that had never been what either of us needed, to free both of us to pursue more authentic lives, even though that freedom would be painful and complicated. The divorce process took 9 months to finalize. It was relatively amicable given the circumstances. Marcus acknowledged that his deception had been unfair to me, agreed to settlements that reflected that unfairness, didn't contest my desire to end the marriage quickly and definitively. Our assets were modest and we had no children, so the legal aspects were straightforward even if the emotional processing was complex and difficult. During the separation and divorce, Marcus began living openly as a drag performer for the first time in his adult life. He came out to his family and friends, started performing regularly under his stage name at multiple venues, began dating men openly rather than hiding his sexuality. The transformation from the emotionally distant man I'd been married to into this vibrant, authentic person who was finally living honestly was striking. He looked happier and more alive than I'd ever seen him, even though that happiness was coming at the cost of our marriage and the conventional life he'd been performing. For me, the divorce meant processing not just the end of my marriage, but the realization that the entire relationship had been based on Marcus's deception and my ignorance. I'd spent 14 years thinking something was wrong with me, thinking I wasn't attractive or desirable enough to make my husband want me, internalizing rejection that was actually about his inability to be authentic, rather than about any inadequacy on my part. Working through that psychological damage required extensive therapy, required rebuilding self-esteem that had been eroded by years of feeling unwanted, required learning to trust my instincts again after having been gaslit for so long about what was actually happening in my marriage. 3 years after discovering Marcus's secret life and divorcing him, I'm 44 and rebuilt into a life that's simpler, but more honest than what I had during my marriage. I still teach, still find meaning in working with students, still build my life around values and relationships that feel authentic rather than performative. I've dated some, have learned what healthy, intimate relationships feel like when both partners are being honest about who they are and what they want, have rebuilt confidence that had been destroyed by years of being rejected by someone who was never actually available to me in the first place. Marcus and I maintain cordial, distant contact. We're not friends, but we're not hostile, both recognizing that our marriage was a complicated situation where his shame and fear of living authentically created pain for both of us, even if the impact on me was more direct and damaging. He's thriving in his authentic life, has built career as professional drag performer, has found community and partnership with people who know and celebrate him for who he actually is. I'm genuinely glad he's living honestly, even though I wish that honesty had come 14 years earlier before he'd married me under false pretenses. What I learned from 14 years of marriage to someone living a secret life is that you cannot have genuine intimacy with someone who's fundamentally hiding who they are. That sexual difficulties and emotional distance are often symptoms of larger issues around authenticity and shame. That loving someone doesn't mean accepting deception that damages you, even if that deception is motivated by their fear rather than by malice. Marcus's secrecy about his drag performances and his sexuality wasn't primarily about hurting me. It was about his inability to accept himself, his internalized shame about aspects of his identity he'd been taught were wrong or unacceptable. But the impact on me was devastating regardless of his intentions. cost me 14 years of my life in a marriage that was fundamentally false, damaged my self-esteem in ways that took years of therapy to repair. The confrontation that finally revealed the truth, finding Marcus on stage performing in drag with confidence and joy I'd never seen at home, was shocking and painful, but also ultimately liberating for both of us. It forced him to stop living the exhausting double life he'd maintained for years. It freed me from a marriage where I'd been made to feel inadequate when the real problem was his inability to be authentic. The mask falling led not to destruction but to transformation. Painful transformation that required both of us to rebuild our lives completely. But transformation that ultimately allowed both of us to pursue more honest existence than what we'd had when Marcus was hiding, and I was unknowingly married to someone who couldn't fully be present with me. My name is Christina Walker. I was married for 14 years to a man who seemed sexually dysfunctional and emotionally unavailable in ways I couldn't understand or fix. What I didn't know was that my husband had a completely separate life as a drag performer, that the person he was on stage was more authentic than the man he performed being at home with me, that his difficulties with intimacy weren't about me, but about the exhausting toll of living a double life. The night I followed him and discovered him performing in a club, the night I confronted him and he finally told me the truth about who he was and what he'd been hiding. That was the night our marriage ended, but also the night both of us started toward more authentic lives. The transformation wasn't easy or painless. But sometimes when a mask falls, what follows isn't destruction, but the difficult necessary work of living honestly after years of deception. And that honesty, however painful, is worth more than any comfortable lie. Thank you for reading. If this story helps you understand that living authentically requires courage from everyone involved, please like and subscribe. Claude é uma IA e pode cometer erros. Por favor, verifique as respostas.